What up, nerds? My name's Ryan. I did my HSC in 2019, and One Night the Moon was one of the prescribed texts I had for English. So in this video, I'm going to discuss the topic of racism and prejudice as depicted in the film. The way it's going to work is I'm going to go through a series of quotes, analyze them, tell you important points, and then show you an example paragraph that I actually used in my HSC. So let's take a look at the quote.
We'll follow up. Ready when you are.
What's he doing here?
Albert? He's a police officer.
He's also a highly skilled black tracker.
Look, that's my daughter out there. I'm not having some darky leading the search.
All right, so there's quite a bit in that scene. The first thing I'd talk about is the string instruments in the background. What do we notice about the string instruments in the soundtrack? Well, they're there's a whole lot of dissonance. There's a whole lot of dissonance. And that means it's lacking in harmony. It's irregular. It has the effect of being tense. It creates a very tense atmosphere. They're also legato, which is basically just a fancy music word for saying long and drawn out. They're not like short and sharp. It's very, I'll play it here, ready? Right, it's very long, it's very drawn out, it's slow. This has the effect of being very menacing, right? It sounds like something's looming, something bad is about to happen. Second thing we notice is the body language of Jim, right? When he walks up to Albert, he doesn't even acknowledge his existence with his body language, other than this little thumb. What's he doing here? And his eyes are looking looking away from him. If you notice, if you watch the clip, he keeps his eyes away from Albert the entire time. Second thing we notice is body language. Second thing we notice is the body language of Jim. And specifically how it's dismissive. And I would say it's also demeaning of Albert's humanity. You're just not acknowledging him at all. Third obvious thing, I'd say, the most stark thing is, what's he doing here? I'm not having some darky leading the search. So the use of some darky, it's a racist choice of words, right? It's a racist word choice. And it has the effect of painting Albert as incompetent, even though we know later in the film that he's the most competent of them all. It paints him as inferior, and it's just downright disrespectful, isn't it? Although that's kind of the least of his worries, I think. Anyway, so yeah, to conclude, string instruments in the soundtrack the dissonance in the string instruments provide a tense atmosphere. The fact that they're legato makes the scene feel menacing. The body language of Jim shows him being dismissive and demeaning towards Albert, and his racist word choice paints Albert as incompetent and inferior. So there's this next part of the quote.
I'm not having some darky leading the search.
Excuse me, sir. This is Albert's country. He knows this land last year.
Now listen here. No blacks on my land. This is my property and I'm calling the shots. Let's get going.
So firstly, this man tries to convince Jim on the basis of Albert's talent and his skill, right? He says, this is Albert's land. He knows these tracks. He knows this land. But Jim is unable to see past the color of Albert's skin when he says, no blacks on my land. So what do we notice about that phrase? It has a very high modality, right? There's no uncertainty in the meaning of this phrase. It's very, very clear. It's clear what Jim's intentions is. It's clear what his views are, right? That's what we call high modality. If a phrase were to be of low modality, that means that it's more vague. It's not as certain. It's also, each word has one syllable. And this makes the phrase sound sharp. It makes the phrase sound staccato, if we're continuing with the fancy music terminology. And this conveys Jim's character When I say character, I mean like the quality of his personality as very arrogant and harsh. This shows this. Okay, and what do we notice about the music right before he says the phrase? We notice that the music cuts out suddenly. It cuts out suddenly, and we have this very close-up shot of Jim's face. And the reason the music cuts out is because the director just wants you to focus on the phrase "no blacks on my land." It just wants to make Jim's words, so it makes Jim's words salient. It makes Jim the salient feature of this particular piece of the scene, right? Cutting out the music makes space for his voice. And so by making space for his voice, the audience is just focusing on the content of his speech very, very carefully, because there's no other distraction, right? And we can see, his mouth up very close. We can see exactly what he's saying. We can hear exactly what he's saying. It's very salient. It grabs the attention of the viewer. The other thing that we notice is that Albert has his head down. Albert has his head down. And Albert also remains silent throughout the scene. He remains silent, doesn't say a word. Now, because this is English, you can't just say, or you could just say that Albert remains silent, right? But what you really want to say is that Albert is a representation of the Aboriginal community. And the silence isn't just literal silence. It represents the oppression of the Aboriginal community. So that's what you want to say in English. You want to take something that is literally true and then extrapolate from it to some more meaningful social issue. Okay, so how do you use this scene in an example paragraph? Well, I'll show you how I used it. So first I'll read this out to you, and then I'll point out important things that you should note and the structure of this paragraph, what I was thinking when I wrote it. Arrogance and discrimination towards people of other cultural identities is detrimental to society, preventing the formation of a communal identity of humanity. When marginalized and oppressed, people become unable to live to the full potential of their talents. As a result, the total strength of society becomes limited. In order for humanity to thrive, a communal identity must be recognized between everyone, regardless of race. The idea of prejudice emerges throughout the film One Night the Moon. Jim's attitude towards Aboriginal people is revealed during the gathering of the search party. What's he doing here? I'm not having some darky leading the search. The use of non-diegetic music. Now, I forgot to mention that. Non-diegetic music is just these string instruments, right? Diegetic music would be sound that is shown within the film. So, for example, there's the scene with the Aboriginal family, the extended Aboriginal family gathered. You hear a banjo and you also see the person playing the banjo. That would be diegetic music, where these strings are non-diegetic. These strings constitute non-diegetic music. That's just a little English technique description that you can throw into your paragraph to show that you know something. Through the use of non-diegetic music, a dissonant legato string section provides a tense and menacing atmosphere as Jim walks past Albert, refusing to look at him. Jim's body language conveys dismissal of Albert's humanity. His racist choice of words, some darky leading, implies incompetence, inferiority, and shows a lack of respect. Another policeman tries to convince Jim of Albert's skill. The music suddenly stops as Jim states, "No blacks on my land." The director's choice to cut the music makes Jim's words the salient feature of the scene. This has the effect of grabbing the responder's attention. Respond is just a fancy word for the person responding to the text, fancy English word. Makes the markers give ticks. After another policeman tries to convince Jim of Albert's skill, the music suddenly stops as Jim states, "No blacks on my land." The director's choice to cut the music makes Jim's words the salient feature of the scene. This has the effect of grabbing the responder's attention, allowing his words to resonate in their minds. His being Jim's words in this case. Allowing his words to resonate in their minds. The high modality language makes the audience perceive Jim as a harsh and arrogant man with clearly racist views. Albert remains completely silent throughout the scene, symbolizing the disempowerment and marginalization of the Aboriginal community in society. This scene serves as a strong example of the power of language in expressing cultural identity. Jim's refusal to accept the help of Albert is due to his tenuous ego and inability to see past color. His failure to recognize Albert's experience and skill as an individual ultimately underlies the tragedy of the story. Okay, so what was I thinking when I wrote this paragraph? Well, the first thing I was thinking was write an idea statement, or write a conceptual statement. And what that is just an idea that, although maybe represented within the text, is not specific to the text. So it's an idea that exists in the wider world, right? And I'd say that there are three main kind of themes in this idea statement. One is the idea of arrogance and discrimination. The other is the idea that this is detrimental. Well, they're all connected really, but arrogance and discrimination is detrimental to society and prevents the formation of a communal identity of humanity. And then the next section here is a link to the text, right? So notice in the idea statement, I didn't actually mention anything that was specific to One Night the Moon. Although I was talking about the ideas that are going to be represented in this quote here, I didn't actually mention One Night the Moon in the idea statement. By the way, don't put spaces between sections of your paragraph in the actual HSC. I'm just doing that for the sake of clarity. This second section here is where I then link it to the text. The idea of prejudice emerges throughout the film One Night the Moon. And then this section here is Jim's racist attitudes. And I'll just highlight some of the techniques that I've used. Non-diegetic music, through the use of non-diegetic music, that's referring to the string section. Well, this isn't really a technique, but the description of the atmosphere, tense and menacing atmosphere. Body language, that's kind of like a film technique. Racist choice of words, so choice of word choice is usually referred to as a literary technique. The director's choice to cut the music, that might be relevant. Salient feature, this has the effect of blah 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 blah. High modality language. So these are all the things that you need to put into your sentences for English teachers to think that you're actually writing an English essay. I don't really think they add a whole lot to your actual conceptual idea that you're trying to convey, but this is the sort of thing that you have to incorporate into your English paragraphs. And so notice that I'm not saying, not once in this section have I said, here is the quote. In this quote, the technique used is this. You don't want to write it like that. You want to try and let the idea flow very naturally in the sentence. You don't want to, the director's choice to cut the music makes Jim's words the salient feature of the scene. I didn't say salience is a technique used in this quote. You have to try and incorporate into the sentence. So you don't necessarily want the reader to notice that you've worked in a technique. Obviously the markers will, because they're English markers, but what they really dislike is when you've just stated it really clinically. They don't like it when you state it clinically, so you have to try and integrate it into the flow of the sentence. And then this section here is the impact on Albert. And this is where I talked about Albert remains completely silent throughout the scene, symbolizing, so that would be considered an English technique, symbolizing the disempowerment and marginalization of the Aboriginal community in society. So, pro tip, English teachers, let's say, tend to be a little more liberally politically minded. And when I say liberal, I don't mean like the Australian Liberal Party. I mean like liberal in the American sense of the word. And so they're concerned with the well-being of people who are disadvantaged in some way. So the more of that terminology that you can work into the essays, the more they're going to like it. So marginalized, oppressed, where else have I used some words like that? Okay, yeah, disempowerment, again, marginalization. And then also use a lot of words that talk about the bringing together of people, so community, society. Obviously, it's relevant. It's very relevant in this paragraph. It's not like I've forced it in, but English teachers will eat that sort of thing up. Like and English markers will eat those sorts of topics up because it speaks to their soul, I guess. For lack of a better word, it speaks to their soul. It speaks to their inklings. Anyway, and this is just a standard conclusion. And what you do in the conclusion is basically just reform your ID statement, right? So where I say arrogance and discrimination up here, the kind of parallel to that would be, where would it be? Tenuous ego and inability to see past color. So this one's quite heavily rephrased, but it's still conveying the same idea. Detrimental to society, that's reflected in tragedy of the story. And the communal identity of humanity, I would say, is reflected in Jim's failure to recognize Albert's experience and skill as an individual. When we treat other people as humans, we have to treat them as individuals primarily before we treat them as members of a particular group, in this case, race. I've restated the idea sentence in the conclusion. Okay, so I have 4 other videos on One Night the Moon. I have one on the differing cultural perspectives of land, the universal significance of family and life, how music is used to convey meaning, how film techniques are used to convey meaning. So those are the 4 other videos I have. You'll see a link to them at the end card of this video. Other thing is, in the description, I've put a link to a video of how to study effectively. I strongly recommend you watch it, not just for English, but for all of your subjects. It helped me get band 6s. It'll help you get band 6s. I strongly recommend you watch this. And it's by a doctor in either Oxford or Cambridge University, can't remember, but it's really, really good. And I want you to spread the gospel to the rest of your friends, unless you hate them. But if you like them, spread the gospel to them because it will help them. All right, so good luck, and I'll see you in the next video.